first episode of Pseud Central. I'm your host, Teapot. Tonight I got with me 5 cheering cops: Maestro, Gallo, Petros, HK, and Brigadero. Yeah, you can introduce yourselves now, Kings.
Здравия желаю, I'm Maestro, student of history with a desire to enter the academia world, and I wanna be Joe Rogan. By the way, have you tried DMT?
So I am Galloglass, or Gallo for short, and I'm relatively new to philosophy as a former microbiology major. And I really haven't read much yet, but I'm hoping to learn more through sort of osmosis in the conversation and just reading more myself. And I might sit back a bit for this first podcast, but this sort of stuff is hugely interesting to me, so expect bigger contributions in the future.
I'm Petros. I work for a living, but I really like to read. I particularly like Nick Land and Deleuze.
Hi, my name is Brigadero. I'm a public administration with econ focus major and a philosophy major. And a little known fact about me is I'm actually the Hindu god of war, the incarnation of Malakasha.
Okay.
And I am HK. Whatever you heard about me from the Internal Security Bureau isn't true, so...
Okay. And I'm Teapot. I'm a musician. I'm an armchair philosopher. Let's put it that way. Professional NEET, study from home. Yeah, I guess you could call me a cultural Marxist, in other words. Yeah, that's about it. So, like, what's up, guys? Like, how are you guys doing? How are you holding up?
Alive.
Mm-hmm.
Kinda.
Like, wait, what?
Kinda alive, kinda
alive. Yeah, me too.
Kinda, you know.
We're all just vibing.
Yeah, well, I mean, we haven't been dismembered yet, if that's what you're asking,
Yeah.
so, you know.
Vibe check watch.
I'm just being myself, but like, has anyone seen The Joker yet?
I have not.
Yep, I did.
I haven't. I have a bunch of questions though.
I've won
Yeah.
3 times, unfortunately.
3 times, unfortunately. Why so?
Unfortunately.
2 of the times I had to watch with other people, and so the experience can tend to be ruined just because they kept talking.
Oh no! I mean, I watched it on my own. I was high watching it.
I mean, I haven't pulled the Zizek and watched the pirated copy like he did. For example, I watched it at the cinema, so I had, fortunately, didn't have too many comments during the movie. Well, I mean, I can talk a bit about the movie, especially since I have a bit of a passion for the Batman universe.
Can I ask you something?
Sure, of
Alright,
course.
so like, what is like the like this fucking like media bonanza surrounding this movie? Like, why do people like all over believe that there's just gonna be a shooting? Like, what's like I don't really understand like why the Joker has become this like symbol of like, I mean, there was that one incident in Colorado, but like otherwise it just seems like sensation to me. Like, does the movie hold up to any of that?
Exactly, it's that and a mixture of we are in a society meme, the Inseldom meme, the one in which I also participate unwillingly, but well, so c'est la vie, as the French people say. And well, basically it actually connects especially strongly to the point that there were shootings during the Dark Knight, that there was the shooting during the Dark Knight. So the media has taken the internet 4chan memory, which has bleeded over Reddit and so on and so forth, mix it with a bit of shooting that happened in the United States, in New Zealand, all the successes and failures of those guys, and basically some people went milsim a bit too hard, so failed to do anything. Others just went full crazy and managed to do something. And they took it, mixed it together, and you've got yourself an excellent toxic bag about a movie which is pretty good in the sense of a purely movie. From a cinematographic standpoint, it's a good movie. It's well filmed. It has an interesting plot. The points it presents are good, like even though sometimes too obvious, but that's a positive, at least in my opinion. And it gained the Golden Lion well deservedly at the Venice Film Festival. Like, it's a good movie. It's not the movie which people are in uproar about. It's the event. It's the memes. It's the other. It's the other of the movie, so to speak.
Yeah.
Like that's
like,
the.
I just want to reply to like Petros. I mean, this is just sensationalism at its highest. I mean, if there's ever been like a sign that the media is completely out of touch with the reality and like just forging some kind of expectation, a reaction from the media, like this is it. Like you really get to think about it. I mean, I guess you were talking about the accelerationist maestro, like the eco-fascist guys with the manifestos or whatever. You're not talking about the insult types, right?
No, I'm talking about exactly about the accelerationism.
War makers.
Yeah. Because like the insults, like some people, especially the media critics. By the way, like if you check the comparison to the media critics on like Rotten Tomatoes, there's a huge discrepancy there, or maybe like that's probably just an issue with like reviews in general. But the thing is, it's like there hasn't been a lot of negative reactions, like whether it is violence or like disgust from normal people. Like the worst thing I heard when I was at theaters on my own, like sure, people were talking, get the usual bad movie experience, but like at the end of it, people were like, it was good, but it was a sick movie. I probably wouldn't watch that again. And like,
well, I get what you're saying, because like most people I talk to like say it's like a masterpiece, but like what I'm reading right now, like you just mentioned, like Rotten Tomatoes gives it a 69%, Metacritic gives it 59%. Which is I think that's ridiculous. Like anyone, like I haven't seen it, but I think that like that level of like and again, like my experiences speak for me alone, in my own world, but I believe that like my experience is pretty universal based on like what I've observed like on the internet, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing is, it's like, in particular, like, it's this emphasis on the incel movement. Maybe it's because of feminism. I'm not sure why that is. Like, obviously, the terror acts committed by right wingers have been far worse, far more damaging than like some loser, that got bullied in high school. That has been a problem.
You've triggered the red libs now, fucking hard.
Okay, like this is not about triggering the red libs. I'm just saying how it is, okay? Right? The U.S. has a lot of problems with mass shootings in general, and like the whole sensationalism over, and this is not about guns. Like I'm just saying, the focus on the incel is absurd. I think, like in this case,
just sort of a effect of isolation within society. I mean, that's the base of it, fundamentally.
I think our academic here, resident academic, will say even better.
Yeah, probably.
So I wanted to kind of underpin the overarching phenomena of it, and because I have a tendency to like to look at the more large-scale or macro view of these sort of things. So if you look at the Metacritic or the Rotten Tomatoes score of it, I would say it underlies a fundamental separation of the supposed experts and media as a whole from the realities of culture, which are becoming more and more entwined and inseparable relative to internet culture. You look at all of these ratings, especially given by quote-unquote movie experts or cinematographic experts, and they all seem to try to almost actively project a lack thereof into their own rating of the movie. You saw the media where they would say, oh, there's certainly going to be a shooting that occurs as a consequence of this movie because it glorified violence to some degree. From my own personal experience of the movie, it doesn't necessarily glorify violence. If you already have a glory to violence in essence, you will take away a different opinion than other people who look at it more about mental illness or the social apparatus as a whole. Pretty much constructed to reflect that. And so one of the fundamental approaches that people tend to take towards this movie and projecting it, especially as a sick movie, is that not only does it show the sickness inherent within some aspects of society, even stigmatize people that are mentally ill, even if they're enlightened about it. Some people who claim to be enlightened on the concept of mental illness, and they don't treat them as, outcasts or subjects to be alienated from, there's still an alienating tendency there in some people, and you can see this evidenced by how the media treats certain types of illnesses in relation to others. But more important, one of the fundamental issues that this movie underpins is that as the internet especially tends to develop its own sphere of culture and sphere of pretty much self-contained meaning within it, attempts by the quote-unquote experts from the outside, academics are trying to look into the meaning or essence of what the internet culture is, but also, scientists, to varying degrees, and media experts, they try to reflect into this, but by the relation they tend to take towards thinking, they're alienated and they're outside of it. So they're trying to pretty much penetrate a sphere which is inherently composed to be for a certain group in a certain milieu of society.
Like, it's a very subjective experience, like, literally. So that's a pretty good way to put it. What did you say, Petros?
I think that I totally agree with Greg on everything he says. I think that also a major feature of this is that it's a democratic. Well, the way that all this manifests essentially into a democratic problem. Particularly in the United States, we have this issue where we have to decide whether or not school shootings and the like are a problem, and then if we do decide that they are a problem, then we have to decide democratically again, whether or not what are the causes of this problem. And the issue is that there's many. It's a systemic problem and it's sociological, but people are looking for really quick solutions or answers. Brig and I, we both own guns. We're it should be known that Lefty Band is pro-gun ownership, but it's just that we should it should be understood that there's a way to be responsible about this, but it seems that democratically speaking we can't come to a conclusion as to how, and I think that disconnect from politically speaking from most people in the country who just see more reasonable solutions that what seems to be coming out of Washington or our local state houses I think the disconnect between what most people want versus the policy that gets pushed forward is also speaks to this effect as well.
Yeah, it's funny though, because in the movie, the guy doesn't have a gun. He never intended to have a gun. He's mentally ill, and the regulations that are put into place, he shouldn't even have a gun.
Exactly.
But someone gave it to him, and because of how society was and how they treated him, the neoliberal, basically austerity measures, cutting the budget. That is what drove him to literal insanity, because he had no medications. He took 7 medications or whatever. And he didn't even plan a shooting. It just happened when he was on the subway, living his regular life as a clown, as you do. But again,
if there could be a regular life as a clown, sure.
Honk honk.
Oh god. You wanted to say something, Maestro, right?
Yeah, the thing which Petros mentions, the issue of democracy and the development of democracy here comes in action my worthless piece of paper that I want to achieve, which is a degree in history. So basically, one of the interesting developments in American history is this kind of drive to the West, which is the main point of the founding of America, the revolution, the war, the revolution. Yeah, exactly. The revolution was fought over this. It was fought over the ability to expand westwards without boundaries, or without boundaries, to go away with the accords that the natives did with the British. That was a main point of the propaganda, to gain sympathizers, because you need to understand that the Revolutionary War in the United States, the revolution in the United States was much more of a effort to convince the 40% of the people which were neutral to side with the revolutionaries, and Manifest Destiny was a big gun. So, how it developed? People moved towards West in this attempt to go further and further. If conflicts developed, people would just say, just go and found your own settlement, just go and found your own experience, and people did so. Basically, the history of America is trying to avoid conflict constantly, and when it couldn't be avoided, you had the Civil War, because people already expanded west enough, far enough that there wasn't any more space, so people decided to kill between themselves. America never developed a way to deal with discourse, internal discourse, with internal issues, with internal problems, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I think a discussion of democracy as a whole is completely fundamental to, especially an examination of the Joker, but what the Joker is supposed to embody and represent. But I specifically want to detail or focus on the modern phenomena that you can distinguish in philosophy, even onwards from people like Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, to Guénon, to Evola, to even people like Jordan Peterson. He tries to pick up on the essence of it, and it's the seeming spiritual alteration of man from being unopposed to violence in cases where it is necessary and where it can be developmental or even ensure some manner of peace, to almost being absolutely avoidant to violence in total. And the way that people respond to a movie like Joker, but even how people within the movie respond to violence, it's almost indicative of this trend where violence is viewed as this object of disdain, but in certain instances, and you see this with how the spontaneousness and even the scale to which the riots occur after Joker kills Murray Franklin in the movie, you can see in the movie the alteration from a more civilized, or as neoliberalism tries to put it, an almost cultured suffering where you take your indignation and you take all of the issues that you have and you bear it silently, and it's embodied in an explosive passion. And so you can even see in this instance where people have a tendency to focus too much on the essence of peace. And so in cases where, there's violence, as the media was trying to say, especially with the Joker movie, where we don't want violence to happen, well, in the instances where violence does happen, or instances within the movie especially where violence happens, like Joker killing the three men and then it becoming a representation of wanting to kill the rich and the rich are being targeted by the poor, people are too focused on the means and the measures by which fundamental issues in society are posed, but they never focus on the issues themselves. And you can look at this in neoliberalism, for instance, the issues that go on in Africa with all of this, the development of NGOs and even the attempts to try to mediate peace in places like the Belgian Congo or in South Sudan at the moment, but it doesn't really, or NGOs and neoliberalism as a whole, they don't focus on what the explosiveness and the spontaneousness of it is supposed to signify. They only focus on the actions of it. I believe it was Evola, and I feel a bit contrite quoting Evola, but I think in this particular instance he can be of vital use, that violence is a bad means to project, supposedly to liberalism or to neoliberalism as is now, a bad means to project your disdain for society. But if you're cultured and well dignified enough to do it, or there's an expectation that you have to be the former two mentioned, and that resorts to violence to show the severity of the matter at hand, are never met unless it becomes life-threatening or fundamentally unstable and undermining to a particular society. And you can look at this in certain dictatorships even, that there's never a responsiveness to the needs of the people unless it becomes fundamentally undermining to them. Instead, they expect them to have this, well-played and well-articulated plan in order to enact the changes, when most of these people that are suffering don't know why they're suffering. And so there's no ability to ultricate or alter that mentality that exists there.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And with regard to neoliberalism, I sort of think it's really interesting how Adorno sort of anticipates the cultural industry sort of colonizing our life world with these liberal ideas of connection between commodity and experience. For example, if you're leaning into your first kiss, you might remember a song or a movie where a first kiss was performed, and you might project that experience onto your own experience, which creates the interesting effect of replicating the media within reality itself. And I think neoliberalism has a big part to play in that.
I mean, going explicit is basically like when you have sex, it's very white in your mind that goes like, that's it. Like, basically. Like you have the jazz songs and everything. You cannot escape. It's a construct in which conditions you to think of certain cultural events, to have a point of reference, to act, to know how to act, this way. That's, for example, why a big problem, which I think would be a good point to talk like in our next podcast, I would say, it's pornography and the impact it has. For example, like you can make a connection between pornography and the cultural structure, for example, the cultural industry of which Adorno speaks of, especially considering that Pornhub, if I'm not wrong, has been acquired by Disney, which is kind of weird. Yeah.
I did not know that.
Does that mean we can? Does that mean we can expect an erotic addition to Disneyland in the future?
I'd say so.
I hope not.
I'd say so. Yes.
Oh, good.
I'm reading Snopes right now. You're done for. Hold on.
Fuck!
It's false. Rating false. The Walt Disney Company has not acquired the pornographic video website Pornhub.
Yeah. Well,
It's
they
Facebook
will.
fake news.
They will eventually.
It's almost like the whole nightmare idea of people like Paul Joseph Watson, when he talks about cultural degeneracy. First you have Hannah Montana, then, the character becomes real, they become Miley Cyrus, and then, they have some horrific thing with Liam, I don't know what his last name is, but some fucking actor, he's being an asshole. Maybe she goes into a mental, fucking schizophrenic episode, cuts her hair and becomes a prostitute. God knows what could happen. But, basically, the idea is Disney was never a pure company. They've always been doing this shady shit. Didn't they get, sold off to, some Chinese company, or similar? Okay.
Ask the Chinese man here.
Yeah, ask the Chinese man.
No comment.
The Disney Corporation has been a primary institution of American and now world media for the better part of the past century. The thing about that is it's expropriation to other cultures and places through things like the Marshall Plan and just the globalization of American culture and the hegemonization of capitalism at large and blah 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 blah. This Disneyness, the mouse has conquered, unfortunately, and that's. It's important to understand though, because it's incredible how pervasive both culturally and psychologically Disney experiences are for people. Gallo was saying before, how that people recall movies and events that have such a profound emotional experience on them that when they go through events similar to those depicted in the movies, they imagine themselves in the movies while going through these experiences. Due to the pervasiveness of Disney, I'd go on to say that this corporation has gone on to define almost to a ploy, dude. From people crying to new Disney releases to who are well into their 30s, and otherwise, the mouse has conquered the hearts and minds of many of folk, and I think that this tendency, especially amongst the West, is destructive, and I think. It's relevant to films such as The Joker as well, because we see this is true for plenty of points of not just film but media. Everything from comics to video games to books and otherwise. We seem to imagine ourselves in the cultural context.
Yeah,
Nothing
experience
is more-
itself in that way is marked by the culture industry, Disney, whatever's putting out the media. We see our world through the lens of various media conglomerates pushed together and sort of schizophrenize our experience in a certain way.
Hey, as it goes, nothing is more destructive than a soccer mom that has an orgasm while driving because Disney released a new animated movie. Imagine the deaths on the road. The road kills.
I think that's the horrifying thing though, is that we let things just and not to be emotional or or weird or moralistic about it, but I just think it's strange that we've let this fucking caricature of a mouse go on to define some of our most cherished and pristine memories and emotions.
Imagine.
Imagine a world where it's all fake. It's all lost. Go on.
Everything is defined by the monolith, which is of monolith of culture, which is at the top of it. You find basically the equivalent of a roadkill, which is a mouse, a very big mouse.
Oh man,
Hey,
God is real and he's a mouse.
It's gonna be great. It's gonna be great. You know, knowing that our
Oh,
One
man.
quick comment, since we're talking about monoliths and almost I would say the univocalization, especially in the culture industry, but we can even go back to how the culture industry tends to reflect the values of, as we were discussing before in this particular instance, neoliberalism and the expectations thereof. Because in the Joker, but also what the Joker is supposed to represent, it's supposed to be almost a picturesque signification of what an inner city is supposed to be like. The more intricate nuances which lie there in terms of personal and social interactions, but almost the monolith that the environment that the movie especially presents, and some inner cities can promote this, is that there's this one particular group in power, and they will always be in power, so they don't have to reform anything. There's no urgency whatsoever to taking care of the poor, no urgency for dealing with the trash issue, which is actually a recurring phenomenon on the artificialized news that they have on there. And you could even reflect this not only in the Disney industry, but in how ideology is treated today. Because I know very well for a fact, if you read most political science or political theory or public administration books today, they all tend to have a fundamental assumption that neoliberalism or democracy is not only the complete. So you could reference, people like Francis Fukuyama or Samuel Huntington, who, in essence, take that history or politics has been completed through the instance.
brother, you're cutting out.
Shit. Uh-oh.
First episode,
Okay.
and we're already dying inside. It feels bad now.
Exactly. I tell you, is the beep which are blocking us, I tell you. It's the Chinese
Yeah.
internal security, it's the FSB.
Yeah.
I think it's just because it's cold out and they.
Sure.
Sure.
HK, do you have anything to say to your defense?
Nothing. I will die with a
Okay.
I will die with a dignity on my face.
I understand. Yeah, so oh god. I wanted to go off, I wanted to extrapolate on Petros' point earlier, especially in regards to the mouse, right? Really, if you think about it, it's just a shape, right? It's just one big coin and 2 pennies, right? And that was the point of it. It was to have this little mouse, this animal that was jolly, high pitched, so you can hear it, I think, and then the 2, 3 little round symbols. You could mass produce that. And before Disney, you didn't really have the rules on the kind of copyright system we have today.
I
And so
interject on that.
Yeah. I just want to say that he copied a lot of other people in the past, and he really tried to make something that other people would copy. And now today, right? They've actually bought up the rights so they can extend what normally would be 65 years, 60, 70 years to 100 years. So we can't use Tarzan, we can't use Donald Duck or anything like that. It's not public domain yet. And you can literally buy this kind of shit.
Yeah, but I will give you a better example of this cultural, how to say, mantle, of this cultural pillar, Coca-Cola, and the color red
Oh, yeah.
for Christmas. It's the color of Coca-Cola. Originally, the color of Christmas was green. When I, for example, talked with a co-worker of mine, very cute co-worker of mine at work, I talked about by the way, we had all kinds of clothing with Christmas clothing, and I made the remark, the color of Coca-Cola is the color of Christmas, and she was yeah, really? People have internalized that red is the color of Christmas because Coca-Cola did a publicity stunt in the early 20th century and the late 19th century in which the color red became part of their publicity campaign. And what logo is more recognizable than Coca-Cola? It's even bigger than Disney. Coca-Cola is everywhere. In every fucking lost African village, you will have your little booth
Yeah.
with the Coca-Cola sticker put on. In every single Xinjiang region, you're gonna have the Coca-Cola booth in every
And when
shitty
you-
little bar.
And when you're getting murdered by Death Squad in Colombia, the last thing you will see is a Coca-Cola emblem on their fucking insignia.
Like, people
God.
forget. People
like-
forget.
Yeah, people forget. But that's the thing, though. It's like we have this narrative that the West have kind of built up around the individual. Like, I'd even go so far to and you can correct me on this shit. It's just my own, like, Zizekian ramblings. But, like, basically, there's this view of the chauvinist male, toxic masculinity. Some people have even said feminine toxicity, or like toxic femininity, like Zizek put it. Like he calls Greta Thunberg the example of a toxic, like female. Really, she's just kind of embracing these character traits that are like presented by males in the top hierarchies. But I think honestly, this movie, like that we've been talking about, the Joker, it goes further into like some kind of toxic individualism, you know, because the very core of individualism is that, well, depends who you listen to, obviously, but if you listen to crazy fucks like Alexander Dugin, who kind of goes into the opposite direction of, instead of you have individuals, he called them individuals, right? Which makes it, they go into this identity. That's all they are. They're either a Russian or a Chinese person or whatever. And individuals would be indivisible, right? They can't be divided into little categories. There's a lot of problems with that.
It's basically discount fascism by Gentile, like really discount fascism by Gentile.
It's bad, but it serves a purpose, right? In the movie, and people talk about Jungian self-realization, you know, embracing your shadow, becoming a monster. Like hundreds of people have made videos about this, but really it's like the stripping down of identity, a person that not only feels no recognition from society, but he really feels like he doesn't even have any values himself, right? So he's not an incel, he's not a part of any movement, he's just expressing his frustrations with how he's been treated.
Well,
and
I would
I
would even go a bit deeper than that. You know, I think you know there is you know, as Foucault sort of puts it in Civilization and Madness. You know, the idea of a madman who illuminates the world through his you know, this is I mean, what is the Joker but a archetypal fool in some ways. You know, the man who is trapped by his surrounding, by potentialities, and also trapped by such a multitude of meaning. You know, as we can see, you know, Arthur Fleck is a man who's trapped by various social conventions, by various social by various social forces and societal, you know, standards that all of these definitions coalesce into something that becomes so complex and so self-referential, okay, that one cannot hope to to express them and I would like to bring back something that Zizek said, you know, something about an exclusive inclusivity. Well, I believe there could be a double negation of that. What Arthur is experiencing is it's an inclusive exclusivity. It's this desire of everything could be done to him, you know. But yet at the same time, he's the one who's asked to exercise discretion while, you know, describing them or, you know, approaching them.
The jester thing, like in regards to this, how to say, craziness which goes around the so-called crazy individual, you know, the complete absurdity, which like reminds me of the painting Stan Cisic, basically the sad jester, the famous painting by Jean Matejko, which basically presents these sad gestures, which stands in the saloon, and behind him is basically all the people which are partying and having fun, and he's sad. They're reflecting on the fate of Poland, which got fucked over so hard that it isn't even funny. Or it's actually very funny,
Well, as Adorno said, we will find laughter when there's nothing to laugh about.
Joker in that not in the movie, but in Joker and Batman Beyond, the animated movie, like when he tortures the first
so
Robin, the Tim Drake, and he's there and presents the torture, and behind all the stern and great, there is only a scared little boy in a cape crying for his mommy and daddy. I would laugh if it wasn't so pathetic. What the hell? I will laugh anyways.
Yeah, but like, I just want to respond to what you said, HK, like about like he literally says in his little notebook, because it's like, for some reason, like some therapists or counselors want you to write your shit down in notebooks, and one of the things he said was like, I hope my death makes more sense than my life, and like not sense,
sure.
but literal sense. But the other thing he said was like, it was a pretty simple point, but it was, I'm treated like I behave, they say to me to behave as if I don't, so he is actually, in his individualism, in his subjective experience, he is just literally being himself, but everything he's learned about himself turns out to be a lie. He's adopted, his mother is insane, he was abused, he has all these traumas, and he feels like he's nobody. He has nothing. That scene, Charles Manson's like, why do you do this? Zizek gives a brilliant point, is like, about the original Joker, that really sparked attention. Well, the otherest one did too, but in The Dark Knight, where he basically, his narrative is very schizophrenic. He doesn't give a consistent narrative at all, and that's not the point. The point isn't to post-rationalize his background and try to understand why he did it. No, he fully embraces the mask, right? So there's this idea of contemporary individualism that, like,
I would
okay,
point
you
out
act a
that the
certain
gamer
way.
edition, of the Joker is much more precise in that point. The big conspiration.
Of course.
But what's fascinating, I think, is that, like he said, Zizek, that the kind of inner self, the inner truth, that turns out to be bullshit when you look at the reality of things, right? And so that's what he's coming up with. He's confronting the bullshit, and he just wants to express that inner violence, and he has no boundaries. And what I find is that, like, living in a society, quite literally, like, I'm not being ironic here,
live in a society
that is constructed by pure ideology, like, there's no substance to it. What is left when there's a bunch of violence is, you have someone, like, he gives the joke in the end, right? And I mean, now we've talked so much about the movie, you're gonna go see it yourself, but this scene is basically the penultimate expression of this, where he's at this live stage talking to a guy that is supposed to be his father figure, and even he mocks him. And he says he was supposed to kill himself with the gun he got. And instead what he did, because he was disgusted by the entire scene, he said, what do you get if you combine a clown or an individual,
Mentally ill loner.
Exactly, a mentally ill loner, with a society that treats him like shit. And it says, you get what you fucking deserve, and then he blows his brains out in live television. And these two events, like the crowds gathering up and trying to bring down the system, and he having his fucking rage, they weren't necessarily connected. And so no one is really to take responsibility, but just, like, society and the capitalist neoliberal system being in a deadlock. And the violence is an expression of that. That was Zizek's interpretation, and I think it's pretty accurate.
Sure.
What our God of War has to say about that?
Oh yeah.
So I wanted to underlie just a couple points because we're talking about culture industry and pretty much conditioning of the individual. I know Angry Teapot explicitly made mention to the Joker almost separating himself from all the passivity and even one could say submissiveness to how the social organization is, unlike the social worker that Arthur Fleck has to deal with, unlike
Yeah.
his mother, unlike everybody else who's a bit more content. And there's usually a distinction, especially made in the mid 20th century or so, in the tendencies that capitalism tends to take, but also culture industry. So if you tie in Adorno, you could tie in Ernst Jünger, Heidegger, and all of them, who tend to make a distinction between the person and the individual. And this kind of originates, or this idea or notion originates within Nietzsche, where the individual is the one, like the social worker or Murray Franklin, where their entire personality is conditioned by what Deleuze would call anti-production, or they have a set goal and they have a set consumption habit, and they almost have a set identity by it. So, Murray Franklin is supposed to be the well-dressed and attractive, television host, and he can't deviate beyond that. The social worker is supposed to dress this certain way, think this certain way, etc.
Yeah, his desire is
tell,
trapped in that sense. Yeah.
Yes, you could tell that Arthur Fleck, he moves from the stage of being an individual to being a person properly. He transitions from being passive and being complacent in the expectation, oh, he's mentally ill, so he has to act this certain way. It's even revealed in the movie that because he's traumatized by all the experiences as a child, that's why he laughs. That's one of his coping mechanisms. It's not inherently a disorder in and of itself. It doesn't exist according to the movie. And so a lot of these simulated experiences he has, like where he dates the neighbor next door to him or a few doors down, and he constructs this elaborate notion of how his life should be, he separates beyond that. He recognizes that utterly absurd, and that even though he may be mentally ill, he's still a person, and so he starts testing the boundaries. And you can liken this to some degree to what Nietzsche called the Übermensch, but then even what Ernst Jünger called the anarch, where you start testing the boundaries of what's socially acceptable. And so he starts doing weird stuff. He starts bringing a gun to a children's hospital. He starts, testing how he can act with the police, etc., etc. And so towards the end of that movie, when he wakes up on top of the police car and he stands up, he acts completely differently. He doesn't seem like the neurotic and very, very ashamed, very, very energetic person that he was Arthur Fleck. He's very calm, especially when he takes on the Joker personality. He's calm, he's collected, he seems well composed, and he seems very happy, even though he says that his life has never been happy. And so you could say that the overall narrative of the movie, when it talks about not only culture industry and mental illness and capitalism and to some degree neoliberalism and the expectations of how poor people ought to act and all that, you could say it's a almost individualistic perception of how the individual changes. Well, I wouldn't say individualistic because that just goes against what I'm saying, but the personal view of how the individual evolves into a person, where he completely severs all ties and all connections that he has to a set identity imposed upon him, and he starts trying to form his own identity. And in being a person, especially in people like Nietzsche and Jünger, you're not supposed to be coherent. He takes coherence in the incoherency that is his life. He doesn't try to force a structure or a symbolism, or he doesn't try to make a unity out of every single action he has. He's fine being incoherent in his actions because that is more of an embodiment of how he is as an individual or as a person in this particular instance than he is than a reflection of how he ought to be within society or his other personality he tries to entertain as fun.
So I think that all this talk about the Joker and how the individual is sort of created as a process of rejecting certain aspects of life sort of ties into what we've been seeing in Lebanon, for example, or the Yellow Vest movement, where in the former case people have been painting their faces like the Joker, but it's not entirely certain what if any general goal they have. It's somewhat of a postmodern revolution, you could say, and you could say a similar thing about the Yellow Vests. They didn't really even have a class character, for example, at the beginning. Not in any substantial way, and now they're basically at the point where they're just a right-wing movement. You know, there's a lot of anti-Semitism, and where there's not right-wing sentiments, it's everything is scattered. So, you know, like Briggs says, it's the individual, you know, coming into reality, forming his own thoughts, but these groups of individuals without a coherent telos, you know, aren't accomplishing anything.
That's why we need Lenin! The old Marxist-Leninist says.
Oh my god, here we go.
Exactly.
Sorry if I may make a quick point. But like you know, as our but to our resident god of war, don't you find him a kind of tragic in certain sense that he that Joker, you know, sees the desert of the real, you know, the sort of absurdity that society, but now that he see it, now he lacks any sort of coherent ideology to even comprehend it, so he becomes a mechanism of pure reaction, of pure, you know, spontaneity. Isn't that, you know, almost tragic in some way? You know, wouldn't you say that?
I wouldn't say it's necessarily tragic because, like I said, there's a fundamental telos of incoherency that's underpinned, especially when he realizes the vapidness of how ideology and the real is constructed. He finally senses that there's a desert in front of him, and as opposed to weeping about not being able to see the oasis any further, of being able to see the flowers any further, for instance, he seems to almost take a sense of joy in it. And you can underpin this in people like Proust, but Jung, Evola to some degree, where you have to look at the situation ahead of you where there's almost a declining, you know, social apparatus depending on your ideology. You know, there's a declining degree of ideology where there's this almost forced homogenization of how neoliberalism ought to be reconstructed. And there's actually a theory, just as a quick side note, in neoliberalism that the best way to have a neoliberal but also a modern world economy is to pretty much westernize. And by westernizing, they call it developmental theory. You have to adopt secularism. So you pretty much have to sever all particular notions of any uniqueness or any cultural element that you have there, unless it's a very, very, very whitewashed version of it that they can use in multicultural fest. But back to the point I was trying to
Japan.
Yes, like Japan, for instance. So, but for the Joker, in this particular instance, when he sees the absurdity of everything before him and he has the incoherence there, he doesn't need to find it tragic. He finds it to be a comedy because it's almost like he steps out of all the illusions that a lot of the ancient Greeks wrote about, and as opposed to finding tragedy in it, he almost embodies this sort of heroism, and that heroism isn't even of his own doing. It's imparted upon. Almost think of like Hercules. It's almost a likening back to Hercules or the various poems and plays throughout history where somebody is forced to be a leader of something, and already they're not composed to pretend of themselves as a hero, but they adopt that because in and of themselves they don't have an identity there because they're incoherent. They're almost a blank slate.
Fair enough.
I mean,
builds up.
Honestly, though, that's like a really good way to summarize it because, like, I've never heard anyone really say that, but it makes sense. If you look at the ending of the movie, he's obviously not trying to become some kind of a representation of political movement, but he kind of, in that interview, he realizes what he has become. Like, even though a lot of the shit that happened to him was not in his control. Like, sure, he killed people. Sure, he did very questionable things. But, like, this...
Questionable but funny things.
Yeah, well, if you look back on it, like, try to rationalize everything, his whole identity was stripped away. The drugs he was on was taken away. And he was just being his, like, unadulterated self to a certain extent. He couldn't contain his inner frustration. Everything that really frustrated him, he expressed, he manifested it somehow into the external, right? And so I don't think necessarily in the end it was about him. He channeled this
intensity.
Yes, he didn't channel it through himself. He channeled it through maybe the other. Like, I can't really find a better word for it.
He has become deterritorialized. He has become the archetype without the essence.
Yes, exactly. And he just didn't care. Like, he could have prevented himself, but he didn't feel the need to.
Well,
Like,
perhaps, but
I
isn't
mean, maybe it's a compensation. I think I think an interesting aspect to explore is what if Joker acted in a what if he acted in a hyper rationalist way, like he acted like his rationality, the ratio, has completely gone into fucking overdrive. Like the biggest tragedy of humanity is derived mostly from the rationality rather than irrationality in many ways. Like the rationalization of irrationality brings out the biggest tragedies. For example, I have a lot of historical aspects, for example, like that, like the Versailles peace treaty after the First World War. Like, it was a rationalization of irrationalization, basically, of irrationality, basically putting the extremely high and absurd sum of reparations which was put was basically an attempt of rationalizing the hate, of quantifying the hate. Positivist thought is the biggest tragedy in Western thought.
yeah.
Well, would that sorry to bring this back, right? But like, you talk about rationalism. Would it be okay to say that this is a form of vulgar rationalism in that in that it is trying to quantify the inherently unquantifiable, the inherently ethereal, and that is what that's why we get Nazis.
Indian Kratos, please.
Well, I mean, like, there's probably some truth to that. I'll extrapolate on that point later, but Brig, you wanted to say something, right?
Yeah, I wanted to say something because we're all mentioning almost the heroism mentality that Joker seems to identify as, but it seems that all of the modern instances that you could record in philosophy and history, you could go, Spengler for this because he deals a lot with this in his specific book, but it seems as of, especially this last century or so, that all of the people who have written about the great man theory, heroism theory, all of the people that are supposed to become quote-unquote persons in relation to individuals who don't have the ability or even the interest to rise above this in particular, we've all underlined almost the similar phenomena of over-rationalization of society. And you could even go back to the attempts by people like Machiavelli in the early humanist movement to almost impose a set parameters on how governance should be defined. You should do this as a prince. You should not do this as a prince. You don't do this because this has this consequence. And it seemed almost as though the over-rationalism of society has left us incapable of having incoherent characters. We need to have fully articulated and fleshed out characters, especially in movies and in film and so on and so forth. It's almost incapable of us to have a mysterious figure there without him being explicitly mentioned as that. And you could go into, especially people like Zizek, where, like, especially with fascism, because he writes about fascism in like Defense of Lost Causes, where he deals with it in more in depth, that people couldn't be satisfied with fascism as a theory unless they were explicitly told that it is empty and it is mysterious right now because it hasn't flushed out enough. And so you could almost underlie that the Joker movie, but also especially how people are responding to humanism and technology nowadays, is that they're intentionally becoming schizophrenic and incoherent in order to show that they're not being limited by the over-rationalization or the imposition of forms, almost, upon individuals. And I mentioned Deleuze's anti-production before as that instant. Every character in the Joker, besides the Joker, has a set narrative and they have a set tendency. Arthur Fleck's mom, Penny, is supposed to be the neurotic and crazy mom who fills her traumatized son's head with notions of vainglory and this illusion that he is Thomas Wayne's son. And then you have Murray Franklin, you have all the various characters he interacts with, but Arthur Fleck himself doesn't have that set and rigid narrative in how he ought to conduct himself. Even when he acts normal in the quote-unquote early parts of the movie, it's not coherent exactly what he has because he expresses different phenomena that can be associated to different illnesses, but you can never really have a sense that he has this particular disease, he has this particular illness, he has this particular a neurotypical phenomena. And so I would credit Joker as being one of those few films in modernity to not only underlie a lot of the large and overarching themes that we've mentioned as of late, but the need to almost return to an incoherence to some degree of society. There needs to be a degree of incoherency there because, like I was mentioning earlier with the whole neoliberalism issue, you tend to impose these forms on certain people, and it's never flexible enough. It never allows for a degree of adaptability. It all becomes prescriptive, whereas if you have that element of irrationality there, and that irrationality is necessarily left there, you can better develop an understanding of various things.
And existentialists might posit a lack of authenticity there as well.
Well, yeah, but like, with the neo-Marxists type, the people that try to incorporate existentialism into this more Marxist analysis, like not even that could, I think, properly like explain this incoherence, right? That came more with the more postmodern or like post-Marxist thinkers, I think, especially during the times of Marcuse, Baudrillard, etc. Obviously, like Zizek and Badiou. Wow. But the thing is, like, this incoherence, it's fascinating to see that the biggest expression of this comes from Hollywood, the very heart of this, like, fake, inauthentic narrativization of the world and society. And, like, Petros explained earlier, in the talk, like, way back, about like how these characters like Mickey Mouse and Coca-Cola, they've become cherished parts of ourselves almost. But the problem is like we've reached a point, well, some people might call like a postmodern condition. I don't think that's enough at all to explain the very horror that we are facing today with the stripping away of identity, of our very dignity as people.
The reduction to a set of specific parameters.
Yes,
we have
exactly. And like there is no whole. Like that's the thing. What it shows is that when you strip away all these things, all you have is like freedom, and freedom can be the most dangerous, like violent thing ever. And
but
there is
sorry to interrupt. In some ways, I think it's to bring this back to what we were talking about earlier, right? With the sort of when we're talking about media sensationalism, perhaps what we're seeing here is a fundamental shift in media. In that, because with Mark Fisher and people like Mark Fisher through capitalist realism has talked about the idea of of interpassivity, of letting revolutionary media doing the work of revolution for us, because we see our future. So this could be to put it in a pessimistic terms, this is just an attempt by the media to deterritorialize and embrace the schizophrenia as a way of coping with its own contradictions.
Well, yeah, but like let's imagine the entire like media as like just one big body, right? And Hollywood is just one of these organs. Well, yeah, I was just about to say, but like in this case, it probably actually has an organ, and I would call that like Hollywood or the main producers, right? But Todd Phillips and the director of this movie, and Joaquin Phoenix himself. Joaquin Phoenix has had a horrible life, pretty much, and they made a like strategic and artistic choice not to make this a Marvel movie. I don't think they even were allowed to. But the thing is,
you mean DC, not Marvel.
I mean, Jesus Christ, man. But the very fact,
the roadkill has influenced you.
I'm gonna be murdered now. Okay, I'm gonna be cancelled. Okay, so
we're all gonna be.
I'll be honest. Okay, I have a Batman comic book, but I'm not that big of a comic fan. The thing is, though, I'm fascinated by these characters, and like the Joker as portrayed by Joaquin Phoenix, it's very different, and so is the directional style of Todd Phillips. Not because of a good script or whatever, but because they give the Joker the main role. He's the protagonist, right? By default, he's supposed to be like not a superhero, not an anti-hero, but he's the main subject, and to a certain extent, you're forced to empathize with him. To be forced to empathize with this
I would
Like,
go even. I would even.
yeah?
I would go further. I think is the film, The Joker, the film is inherently ideological, and the greatest thing they have done, okay, is to make the cinematography complement the ideology. To flesh out what this ideology represents. And that is the great thing done.
That's true, but on the other hand, like this idea of breaking free from, like, because that's the thing. If you take a movie in DC, or like in like the DC crew, you have to do all the other movies, and you can't just have this utter violence, just kill people on live television, like have an act like that. And when people came up to ask Joaquin Phoenix, he's known, like he's infamous to make interviews awkward, but he just walked away when they try to connect it to the incel movement, right? And so, like, what they did,
Powerful man.
like they really broke a lot of the social norms of Hollywood. And honestly, like I'm not sure if that's what triggered the reviewers, but it really, I think, blew the expectations of the reviewers primarily. But it did kind of it did conform to the expectations of the audience, mainly by the performance of Joaquin Phoenix and the sheer and brutal violence of it. But I think it has a lot more deeper implications than any of these like left tube videos try to explain, or Paul Joseph Watson, or the reviewers. The closest one to Zizek, I think, is like Michael Moore, who tries to give basically like tries to explain it's the austerity measures, like when he tried to explain the gun problem in America, and how we probably should have talked to the Columbine shooters, like not just neglect them, like we should recognize every member of society, and so on and so on. So like I think it is very significant what has happened in Hollywood with this movie, but for a variety of reasons.
God of War, microbiologist.
So I want to make one comment, and then we can all do our concluding comments.
Yeah,
since we're getting towards the end here.
Yeah.
I wanted to mention, because we're talking about the phenomena of what goes on in the Joker, but more especially we've tended to focus on the concept or the topic, especially of how the individual tends to treat itself within society, within trying to differentiate itself, and so on and so forth. And I wanted to give a counter argument to any potential possible alternatives they could have there, because you could go into the numerous people now, especially nowadays, where they tend to kind of project all of the issues that we're facing within society and all of the evidence that we're trying to get upon the issues to technology. And I don't think necessarily very fair to say that it's technology that is the cause or at the roots of all of these problems, or that it's technological alienation that causes Arthur Fleck to become the Joker, or any of that. I think technology is just a means by which it's been more and more exasperated to be a more public phenomenon than it was in the past. But even then, you could go back to the Industrial Revolution, where people started to have a semblance of where they stood in relation to one another. With technology, it made the exploitation a lot more unbearable, and it made it a lot more than just physical exploitation, because obviously there's some manner of class consciousness in the era of late Rome or feudalism, but it's not as fleshed out as it's becoming now, because technology didn't define not only the way that people conducted themselves, but people could pretty much regularly separate themselves from the social element at times as well. When you weren't harvesting, you weren't expected to do a whole lot, pretty much. You were expected to till the fields, but you could go about your daily interactions, and you could go on pilgrimages and whatnot. But as technology has been a means to exasperate it, but it's not necessarily the direct cause in and of itself, the issues that a more and more complex social apparatus begets is that the phenomena at hand seems a lot worse. And so it's very easy to blame technology, that, Arthur Fleck, the technology that he has, or the over-reliance upon drugs, for instance, makes him feel more and more alienated than he would in a natural environment. But I would argue, in effect, that the Joker gives us a very, very multifaceted understanding of how society works. And like you mentioned, Angry Teapot, you could approach this from every which direction, in essence, of how to analyze the situation at hand. But to try to reduce it down to one phenomena, or try to say, the evolution of X has made it seem more and more worse, that I wouldn't say that's very fair. I would say you have to look at it from every which angle, and that once this movie has become, to the status where the likes of the modern Adorno has written on it, and everybody has given a commentary on it, then you could try to pose a more quote-unquote structuralist critique, like happened in the 1960s, where the modern advent of Hollywood wasn't yet really defined. And, you have people like Lukács and Adorno who tried to articulate it, but it seems very fragmented. And we're almost in a similar epoch where we can't say it's just this one phenomena. We can try to expound one phenomena, but clearly this is one of those movies that it won't be understood for at least another decade properly in all of its context and even its unknown and indirect historical implications of history that hasn't happened yet.
Yeah.
So in some ways we must become like the Joker. We must embrace the schizophrenia.
Well, I mean, we're kind of forced to. It's not that, there's an ought here. I think, that's the main point.
Yeah,
if there is a point.
As a result of all this bombardment of useless information, the isolation of the isolation of vulnerable individuals, and the complete destruction of ideology coming into the 21st century, it's no wonder that these revolts and uprisings are occurring with no real telos, no real objective.
Well, people, lack of ideology.
A lack of the vanguard party, I say.
Stop, dude.
And here we go,
Well, I mean, okay, if you ask a person like Zizek, he has all these ideas about culture, about society, but in the end, when you ask him, what is your solution? And he would probably say something like, you need a master to pull you out of this inertia, to kind of force you to be free. And because there's a lack of this kind of master, then you're kind of forced to break free from this individually, and this just happens through violence or any kind of.
That would not be a Zizek take, though. A true Zizek take would be, don't act, just think.
Well, at the same time, it's not so much that you should just sit on your ass like your average left com. I mean, this is just self-criticism, right? But at the same time, it's but at the same time, he argues for this kind of neo-Leninist, neo-Trotskyite kind of not vanguard party, but a new global order that could take a collective responsibility, and what these new masters are, we don't know yet. But we are creating them, and they don't necessarily need to be the technology either.
Basically, back to the basics, master and slave dialectics.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
The real Zizekian take, in my opinion, would be he would say, don't think, don't act, because if you're asking whether you need to think or you need to act, you're not in a position to do either of them.
Oh, gosh.
It's quite a double negation, quite literally, actually. But
it works.
It works. But the question is, do we even have a choice? We are free, but...
Yeah, what is the role of human agency in the coming decades?
Yes! Yeah.
Philosophers never provide an answer. They just make bigger questions, and I think this is the best point, to leave people with a head full of stupid terms of pretension, because we did a lot of pretension in this hour, I say.
Well,
we'd be most pretentious, brother.
Well, to wrap that up, right? That's the thing, is it's not about rationalizing and trying to understand, channel it from the individual's perspective, try to hand it down. Yeah, we need better health care, we need reform, blah blah blah. It's
no
more about,
shit, moron.
But it's more exactly, no shit. But we're left at this impasse, this deadlock, where liberal democracy can no longer provide answers for political violence and political disorder, social incohesion.
I mean, did it ever really provide answers? Or
No,
did it just provide the mask?
For a time, it provided an illusion of an answer.
Yeah. Exactly.
The idea that the liberal idea we could all exist together with our own ideologies, and that somehow wouldn't end up in a gigantic clash.
Oh boy.
Well,
My last comment on this is, this discussion, but I also imagine this podcast and everything we'll analyze, it'll give us an understanding that, maybe things that we've historically written off might have had some sort of essence within them that we almost need to recognize that not everything is complete. Ideology is not complete, nor would I argue it probably will never be complete, because there will always be some sort of reoccurring phenomena or reoccurring problem that will make even the most sound of ideologies fundamentally undermined. And so I think that in the spirit of the Joker, but also the phenomena we've spoken of, we should maintain some degree of incoherency to try to better understand all of this, because one of the crediting factors I would give to everybody in this conversation right now, but also probably in the subsequent podcast we'll have, is they don't try to reduce it down to one phenomena. They readily admit that this is a problem far surpassing us. This is probably far surpassing almost the entirety of humanity for the time being. It requires more and more generations to better understand what's going on. We have one of the best understandings of ideology, but even then, it's still kind of fuzzy for us. It's still a gray space for us. We can kind of see the outlines of it.
There is still potential for growth and potential for rearrangement as well. Say.
Yes. Yeah. It's one of those things where we may think that we have it mapped, but to some degree, we probably don't fully have it, because it might not be a two-dimensional object. It might be three-dimensional. And so, as in the spirit of this discussion, but also in the spirit of wrapping it up, which I think everybody would agree is a good idea right now, we should readily admit that most of our opinions will probably change on anything we've said. And that is completely fine, because like everybody who is watching this, or like everybody who participates in this, we are trying to learn ourselves. We are just providing our own takes and our own perspectives on it to varying degrees. And throughout this conversation, most of us probably didn't have any of these ideas. Most of these are spontaneous.
Yes,
and it just shows that it shows how almost two-dimensional human thought is. But as time goes on, we seem to progress more and more, and we have more complexity. And so I just want to say thank you to everyone here, but also thank you to just the openness that we have.
Exactly.
Yes, and thank you to our listeners.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So,
by the way, send money.
exactly. And you can do
buy
that
our merchandise. I'm drinking on a lefty cup right now. It's red, and it's quite good.
You can find them on Lefty. Just Google Lefty Band Red Bubble, and you will find the merch. It's overpriced as fuck, but support us anyway.
Yes.
So to finish off with a vulgar joke, what do you get when you combine 6 intoxicated Pseuds with a 2-hour-long podcast? You get what you fucking deserve. That has been all for Pseud Central.
You will find us on
Thank
YouTube, SoundCloud, and I don't know where the fuck else we'll
Pornhub.
upload
We're on Pornhub, most definitely.
Farmers only as well.
They may take our ad money, but they will never take our freedom to shitpost.
Yes.
Bye.
Jesus, all from us. Bye. Bye.
Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Epstein didn't kill himself. Is it just me, or is it getting a little bit cringier out there? Like, I've been following politics as of late, and it's just keep getting worse and worse and worse. So with this whole, like, fucking media sensationalism of the Joker, there hasn't been any shootings yet. There hasn't been anything. What we do see, however, is an increasingly violent political reality. And I don't know, like, when is it gonna explode? Like, that's my question. What is gonna happen? Is it gonna elevate into some political chaos?
What should be understood here is that, like, this is just like a history of media in in this country. It's nothing but just sensationalism. I mean, historically, we have like decades and decades of just movies that people have attributed to like violence or like condoning like terrible acts. I think that, like, honestly, like, that this is no more than just like a modern day moral upheaval, in much the same way that we used to get mad at women for reading.
That is true. Like, sensationalism has made the good part, and I think that's to the advantage of the movie itself, I would say, even because everyone has made a video about it. Like everyone I say from it, like from big figures in philosophy, for example. Zizek has made a video. It funnily enough, like a exactly like a true Eastern European Zizek has watched the pirated copy rather than go to the cinema and so on and so forth. So you know. Exactly, he probably watched the movie, like the pirated version, the Indian theater with the person that stands for 40 minutes in front of the camera, so to hide it because somebody comes to
Finest quality for our Lord and Savior Zizek.
Exactly, there is this kind of refinement, this kind of perversion, how he would express it, in watching his media, which was excellently like the cinematography in the movie is top notch, one of the best cinematographies I've seen in a long while. So I say the Golden Lion that it obtained at Venice, at the Venice Movie Festival, is more than merited because as a movie, technically speaking, is excellent. So we have all the people doing all sorts of all sorts of videos. Hell, even the quartering upper echelon gamers, all the gaming channels even do that about it, which is just absurd. Like, it's beautiful.
So in some ways, it seems media criticism, or indeed the upheaval of media criticism, has become a new form of collective activity. Where every one of us dishes out our own 15 minutes of hatred.
Yeah, so I haven't seen the Joker myself, but what's particularly interested me is sort of how the face paint that the Joker wears has been replicated in revolutionary activity going on in places like Lebanon and Ecuador. It's just been really interesting to see the sort of connections people who are facing violent persecution make to a sort of sensationalized character in this way.
I mean, we need to consider the media history of, in general. It's as Petros has indicated, it's everywhere. It's just kind of it's integrated part of the socio-economical system, which is global right now. The system of the capital. It's a global system.
The West is a history of people just becoming like not necessarily offended, but like trying to find a way to cope or manage with like a traumatic new experience, and like whether that new experience is new media, new culture, or otherwise, like we like the conservative elements of our society seem to like just like recoil back at horror and much in almost like a Freudian age regressive way, where they feel as if like this new media, like it's so troublesome and so problematic that we need to return to form. Like and there's like countless examples, like I said earlier, from like women reading to like literally virtually anything that occurred under the Roman Empire to like other examples as well. I mean, it's like like it's a history of mankind to like place morological abstracts on pieces of technology that they're like totally not familiar with in the first place. I think that that's just natural for people who like are unaccustomed to like a new concept.
It's also assumed that technology is sort of morally neutral when the way we experience and interact with technology is obviously quite influenced by the people making the technology, the people who develop the software that we use and collect our information, and I think it's important to keep that in mind as well.
Yeah, God, like I remember when, well, I wasn't born then, so I can't remember. When I think back on people like Baudrillard and people that want to really like criticize the developments of like technology under capitalism, I just think of how wrong or how like plateaued the whole cyberpunk movement became. Like with especially with movies like The Matrix that really like misinterpreted an entire generation of postmodern philosophers. And like with the Matrix, you have people like Zizek when he went to the theaters. There's an article about this where he just goes to a theater back when seeing like a movie wasn't a political action; it was just seeing a fucking movie, you know. So he sat there all by himself, and this guy like during a scene where I think what's the black dude again? But
Morpheus.
Morpheus, that's right. Goddamn. Okay, Morpheus gives this like red pill, like not no pun intended, right? But like he presents the idea, and like the person behind, like next to Zizek, he says, "Oh my God! So they're like actually controlling all of us. Like this is not reality. There's someone up there, and then we're just like little dolls that are controlled by these wires and shit." And then Zizek just says like, "Oh my God, what an idiot!" Like this pure ideology, right? And I don't know, like
Pure ideology.
yeah, really. But he obviously he provides a much deeper criticism. Not only the movie, but yeah.
I think an interesting thing that's like fascinating with like all this is that the way that like movies and media, literally in our own time, like come to influence like our philosophical beliefs. Like, for example, Nick Land in his essay, either cybernetics or circuitries, I can't remember which one, but he goes over explaining like the state of our world through metaphors to Blade Runner. Like the Deleuze does much the same with 80s movies as well. I think that like it's actually fascinating to find that like we can look to media and culture like we can look to poetry, like we can look to like this magnanimous fiction and come up with new ideas and new concepts that would like help us explain like our own lives. And I think that like that's like really important. Like and I think that like what we're witnessing with like things like the Joker is like that process essentially of people just like coming to terms and like being at odds with like a new media that's like like supposed to be taboo. But then we also have to consider, is this just a marketing gimmick? Like, of course the Joker was going to be taboo when it came out. I mean, like, like we've had like so many mass shootings in the United States this past year that like no shit, like this would be like some kind of like crazy media nightmare. Like, and I think that's honestly part of it. I think that that's like what it makes the movie like great. And I haven't seen it, but like I think that that's a major selling point. I mean, another example of that is The Interview with Seth with what the hell is his name?
Joaquin Phoenix.
Seth Rogen. Like
Seth Rogen, yeah.
Like they go into out there into like North Korea and like and like we were buying that movie and watching it under the understanding that was banned in North Korea, that this like caused a political upheaval of some kind. Like we went into that movie theater with this notion. We were like, what could be so magnanimous that it would cause this? And it's just sweet comedy. Like it's and I think that like a lot of that was nonsense as well.
Oh yeah, like I remember right after, like they released that movie. Not only were they sued, but I remember what's funny about that is the reaction from North Korea towards the rest of the world. They actually did computer hacks, like some of the biggest ones in history, with WannaCry or whatever. I just thought that was like a funny little anecdote.
Oh yeah, WannaCry. Yeah, I remember hearing about that.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry. So, well, to go back to on the sort of more character analysis. Okay, so like since we're talking about the whole idea of media misinterpreting the sort of philosophical theory that they're supposedly trying to represent. This brings us to our first talking point. Is Joker the anti-Neo? Has we have finally achieved a sort of a symbiosis media now that perhaps for the first time, okay, that media is correctly representing the sort of philosophical conundrum they are, have often tried to present.
Yeah, I really want to get into that. Although, Gallo, did you want to say something like on that?
Oh, I had something to say about about Petrus's point on sort of how the media affects what we do in our lives. For example, Adorno had the notion that our ways of living are sort of colonized by the media we consume. For example, if you're experiencing a first kiss, for example, you're probably going through your mind like what's going through your mind rather is scenes from a movie of a first kiss, and you're sort of living that out emotionally in your own lived experience.
Or songs.
Yeah. And songs, yes. Media just completely influences the way
I mean,
we experience reality in the culture industry is like the focal point of that.
like, you know, right in our face, man. Like every time there's a couple out there that says, "Hey, that's our song that was playing when XYZ," like how we like associate like hyperculture, like capitalistic media, like how we begin to associate that with like our most cherished and meaningful memories. Like this is merely the tip of the iceberg. Like
Yeah.
Yeah.
Some some people might refer to this like reading to, you know, the usual reaction to this kind of analysis, because most people arrive at this point, but then they like in this kind of horrified way just shrug it off and say, I'm reading way too much into it. Like that's the usual reaction.
They're blue pilling themselves. The fucking idiots.
Ah, yes.
Normies, the NPCs.
So wait, the Joker is his Joker is the anti-Neo. He took the blue pill, so but having an awareness of reality.
I mean, in some ways, right? So, like, you know, to establish a sort of character, right? Neo as a character, you know, depicted in his film, Mr. Anderson, use his, you know, Matrix name. Okay, he is a white collar worker. He is perfectly financially stable. He has, you know, various incomes. He has various income sources, and he has some pretty high end equipment, as you know, as sort of depicted in his life as a hack, right? Whereas Arthur Fleck, the Joker, is the exact opposite. That his life is tumultuous. You know, he experiences harshness and dreadful harshness from his surroundings. Okay,
I mean,
sorry, just
yeah, sorry. From a point in a view, I think that is actually even a weakness of the movie in some ways, in the sense that, you know, that usually movies like try to present this kind of unique point in the character. So the Joker, for example, in the comic books, the Joker is presented as this average guy that worked at the chemical plant and wants to strike it big in the comedy. The Killing Joke represents at least is one of the origins. The origin of this Joker instead is of a very specific kind. His mother has a mental illness, he has a mental illness, like there is this kind of he's at the bottom rung of society. Like in some ways the strength of Matrix in some points is presenting that Neo is this guy that can be everybody. Like the Joker is a very specific guy, you know, in this kind of thing.
But isn't that part of the point with Joker though? Is this idea, because let's be honest, you know, Joker isn't so much a is not so much a story as the birth of an ideology or an ideological perspective. So like the whole idea is perhaps with the Joker is the fact that he is indeed a lower rung person. He is the proverbial white working class. You know, perhaps that is something. And I think that is something that is the media does try to reach across in his depiction.
Well, I mean, what is interesting is if you focus on the experience of the actual character, you could really say that maybe he's not necessarily like the anti-Neo in maybe what like the authors intended it to be. Because like the whole point of Neo entering this kind of desert of the real, he's no longer in the illusion anymore. He's the chosen one. He's like a fucking messiah, basically. And he's entering the very code, the fabric of reality, and is trying to fix the algorithm. Like, it's very deep and abstract. But like with the character, like Arthur Fleck, which is pretty funny because Fleck in German literally means a stain, like a meaningless stain. And he's called Happy by his mother, you know, that lied about him, his father being Thomas Wayne. He was just a fucking, like, he was adopted. And, like, a lot of his life was just based on an illusion, a lie. His father wasn't Thomas Wayne, and his mother was mentally ill, and God knows what else. And you have the Hegelian notion of recognition, right? That a lot of people, all these videos on YouTube that tries to explain what the Joker is about, whether it's like some Jungian notion of individuality, exploring your dark side, like your shadow, and like becoming the mask. Zizek likes the idea of him like stripping away all of his identity, and he's clinging on to the only thing that remains, which is the Joker, and that his idea is not necessarily tragic, but instead it's a comedy, and he realizes that kind of like more heroic end. It's not heroic, it's violent, it's brutal, but he's experiencing something, what he at least experiences as authentic, right? The problem is there is no political action. It's just pure like violence, and this violence is, I would honestly say, like with this political nihilism that he experiences, is I have no values. I don't believe in anything. I am nothing, right? This is what I claim would be the desert of the real, right? There's nothing. Like Zizek said, like there's literally nothing. Like it's just a void, and then you form some like not identity, but you fall in love, everything collapses, and for him it just happens to be the ultimate negative experience. I don't know, man. It's a very schizophrenic movie. You need to see it for yourself in order to truly understand it.
That's the point of strength, I
Yeah.
would say, of the movie, because like at the difference of Neo, there is this kind of thing. Baudelaire in his work that he presents, like he presents his main criticism that there was too much big of a separation between like the simulation, which in the Matrix was present, and the actuality, in where in reality it is kind of point is actually like the point of the simulacra is that you cannot distinguish it. There is no distinction. It's integrated, both the real and unreal. This is the strength of the Joker movie, in the sense that the cause of this schizophrenia, we have this kind of trip of confusion. What is real? What is not real? There are some details which are left, which there is this kind of very, how to say, it's a much more loyal presentation of the book rather than the Matrix.
I mean, even then, in some way, to go back to the whole idea, the link between Baudrillard and Zizek, right? So like another thing that I would like to bring up about the whole idea is the death of ideology as presented by Arthur Fleck. The problem, and yes, in very much, it starts off very much the same. He is the man who is being stripped of what he once was. His proverbial killing of the mother. The sort of rejection of. But at the same time, when stripped of all ideology, he no longer knows what to do. So he is presented as So this is what Zizek talks about. Okay, this idea of if human beings without language could somehow communicate on a much more visceral level. No, you wouldn't. You would just be a deaf mute idiot wandering around the street looking at the madman. And this is what happened to Arthur Fleck by stripping himself of all ideology and while the Joker, the personification of absurdity, in a sort of a Foucault, in a more Foucaultian sense. This man who is trapped at the conjuncture between potentialities, okay, stripped of all he was. He no longer knows what to do, which is why his only response is to shoot somebody he doesn't like on TV, and even then that is a moment of spontaneity more than anything.
Going back to like earlier points, I would like to explain like what the desert of the real actually is.
Yeah.
Definitely.
What Foucault gives us is this notion that essentially like things like the humanities are a lie, right? Like that's like his great idea. One of his great ideas, obviously, he's a wonderful thinker, but this is important to understand, right? Because here we are, most people today in 2019 engage in what basically Enlightenment grade level modern philosophy, right? Like, that's kind of how they think and believe. Most people, like, particularly in the U.S., they read the Constitution. They're like, okay, my rights are given to me by the state or God. It doesn't matter. Blah, 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 blah. And this is founded in the humanities, or as we should call the notion of the humanities, because what we find with the humanities is that this has never existed. Um, we in the Enlightenment era, with that theory of man as the ultimate experiencing machine, as like the pinnacle of being and so forth. This is grounded on Renaissance thinking, which is it almost comes about as a rejection to earlier church beliefs and that period of history in general. What we find in that period is that is a return to form of air quotes classical ideas. We attribute at this point ultimately the humanities to the Greeks. This word, the humanities, does not exist to them. Like there's no such thing. They don't have the notion of the humanities. They just merely have it's just called that. So here we have a copy of a thing that never was. Therefore, we live in the desert of the real because it's all not real. Because that's what the desert of the real ultimately is. Is this we live in a world of where everything's a copy of a notion that never was.
It's pure ideology.
Well, it's a game of Chinese whispers, everything that is passed on, it becomes more and more distorted. And
I mean, honestly though, I can with complete sincerity say that we live in a society of pure ideology. And what I mean by that is especially now after a movie like The Joker, they're literally sitting there on the top of their toes on their little journalistic chairs, waiting for the camera to roll, updating on the latest shooting or whatever. It's another Monday, another shooting, but it's not happening. What is happening is this increase of political violence. We're seeing it literally everywhere. We're seeing it in just right now, literally less than 24 hours ago, I think. They're trying to stage a coup on Evo Morales in Bolivia after an election. It was just a slight, how should I put it, setback for the president. But in general, people are becoming a lot more violent. It's no longer about peaceful protests. And the thing is, it's this movie, really what it is about, it's not about some positive solution coming from the violent order or whatever, but neither is it some kind of a organized political vanguard party. It's just the slow, boring, very incremental, boiling over the top reality where you have people like the Joker that arise from the injustices, the contradictions of the material conditions, right? But that's the thing is had they changed that, which is Zizek's point, it would have been a boring movie. Instead, this guy has just no values, and that's the thing is I think he better than ever represents the average druggie, average criminal, even though he's not a psychopath. That's just the general mentality of people, and there is no way for the liberal democracy to actually deal with these people. The social contract doesn't apply for that.
Yeah, a very strong point you've made. Initially you spoke about how this kind of movements, of political movements, this kind of leaders, this kind of. I've read an interesting article in the CSIS journal, which is basically an organization of geopolitical analysis, which talks about leaderless revolution. How apart from the trite and from the trite liberal wording which was in the article talked about the aspect of how, as you indicated, political aggressive movements today do not have a leader. It's this kind of just angry reaction. Okay, a Leninist would say, traditionally speaking, a Leninist would say, yeah, then they need the traditional party, but the traditional party cannot, the vanguard traditional party cannot answer the needs of what it is, because people don't know what their needs are. Nobody knows what their needs are. It's not even the party knows what their needs are. We are stuck. The problem is that we are stuck in this kind of this kind of structure in which we cannot see beyond, as Mark Fisher says, capitalist realism. Like, we cannot see beyond that, so we are angry, but we don't know why we are angry. Like in the end, we cannot see beyond that. Like, that's the problem. The lack of utopia, the lack of an alternative, so to speak.
Yeah.
So going off of the how you described the sort of movements as more of a
Leaderless revolution.
leaderless aggregate mass, I think it's sort of interesting as Petrus has described the desert of the real. I mean, we're more and more seeing sort of the symbolic order that organized our society and, showed us how material ideology ought to map itself is falling away, and we're sort of just seeing the rise of these amorphous groups, as you say, with no real leaders, no general goals. Like you take the Yellow Vests, for example. Their ideology was never very clear, and they've since been co-opted by anti-Semites. So it's just really interesting to see the configuration of these modern, sort of pseudo-revolutionary groups who don't have, a plan, a leader. They're sort of they are aggrieved, but they don't know what they're aggrieved against exactly. They can't name it.
I would like to interject. I think I will say, sort of looking at from the perspective of what Mark Fisher says, right? This sort of but wouldn't this make less of a revolutionary movement and rather more of an action in absurdity? This rejection of, not so much rejection, but rather a lack of ideology, as presented by the Joker. Now that after stripping away ideology from himself, he no longer understands the world, and this is perhaps what is happening to these people. They by removing ideology from their actions, they find themselves less able to understand what they can see the absurdity but cannot describe it.
Well, yeah, exactly. Like, if anything, what they understand is that it's a violent system, whatever is going on, right? And, like, for the Joker in the movie, he sums it up pretty well in the end, like with what do you get when you combine, or the clown that is treated like shit by society, what happens if you combine a clown that is with mental illness and drug problems, and he's treated like shit by society. You get what you fucking deserve, is his punchline, and then he shoots the guy, right? And this was all on live television. Yeah, he literally did a vibe check because he was being used. No, like literally, he was like, "Why do you come on stage with a clown? Are you part of the political movement?" It's like, no, even though he literally started it inadvertently by he was dressed up as a clown, and then some people he has this laughing disorder which he has no control over, and he actually tried to help some women on the bus. So you had the implement of sexism, of fucking men just being very aggressive and picking on the little guy, like this general chauvinism, and you have this guy just laughing in pure absurdity, right? And what's funny about that is, like, in the later parts of the movie where he's completely stripped of identity, he doesn't say, "You know what, Mom, like, I never had this disorder. That's just me. That's what I am. I'm not this label that you try to put on me." And like this reaction, this violent reaction, he's not a leader. He's not trying to prove anything. If anything, he's just a manifestation of the underlying violence in the system, and he's trying to basically express his inner frustrations. And it doesn't lead anywhere. That's the traumatic point. We have to come up with the solution.
Exactly, if we take an orthodox interpretation which was provided by leftist thinkers, because right-winger thinkers also provided interpretation of these aspects in regards to, like, they present a more militarized society as this kind of extrapolation of violence, as you indicated. This extrapolation of violence in orthodox leftist thinking, so I'm referring to Lenin, is basically imperialism, you know? So when imperialism is finished, when the other isn't existing anymore, the system turns into itself and starts to devour itself because it needs something to devour. So we talk like this is the classical interpretation. One would say it become a bit more nuanced and complex as a thing, as a system, especially if we insert things like Lacanian psychoanalysis and like if we insert those things, the concept becomes a bit more complex. Right now we're seeing a collapse because there is a lack of outside outlets in some ways. So it's kind of a mess and a half. Like, there are some solution provided by orthodox interpretation, there are some solution provided by new interpretations or postmodern interpretation, and so on and so forth. So we have this kind of weird hybrid Frankensteinian monster which cannot be fused together, otherwise it comes nothing else than just stupid things.
Well, I mean, to sort of bring it back when we're talking about contradictions of the system devouring itself, right? I believe you can see a sort of distinct sort of an ideological, because like Zizek talks about something known as an exclusive inclusivity. Well, I would like to perform a negation of a negation of that, and I would like to introduce something that is an inclusive exclusivity, which is what what Arthur Fleck experiences, right? So like there are these horrifying acts that could be done to us, yet we are asked to exercise discretion in describing. We are being removed of our tool to even describe what is happening to us. As kind of a sort of a reality becomes more absurd than our tales, because the culture industry, in conjunction with the ruling powers, curtail our ability to describe what we experience.
Yeah. I mean, this gap, right, is something that we ultimately, like, as individuals can never really close. I mean, like, this is what we're left with. And I don't know, like, to round it up, with all these emancipatory projects going on around the world, I still feel at a similar impasse as, like, the end of the Joker. Like, I don't really feel that leadership. Maybe it is true that we need new masters, as Zizek says. Maybe we need a new global order that isn't, necessarily ran by the liberal democracies that have really led to this kind of deadlock. I don't know how to do that. Neither does Zizek or anyone else, I think. It will probably come about organically. All I know is that, like, these things that media likes to focus on, like LGBTQ plus questions that has to do with identity politics, I don't think it's gonna be the defining factor of the major changes that are about to come. And I'm just glad that people are, especially Hollywood, are waking up to the fact that reality is more complex and that we actually don't know how to deal with this violence. I don't know. Does anyone else have anything to add to that?
No, because we're done recording.
This has been Pseud Central. Thank you for tuning in.
This has been Pseud Central. Thanks for tuning in.